and I started writing on security politics in early 80s. And I was writing my doctoral thesis on philosophy of power. And the historian professors at my institute said that they didn't understand anything. So I had to choose another topic. And then I was writing on US Maritime Strategy and the geopolitics of Northern Europe, which they were not happy about really, but they couldn't, change it twice, so to speak. So that was what happened, and it was actually a friend of some of us, Ulf Svensson, who said, you should write on security politics. Do that, and I did, and afterwards I realized that some people were not very happy about it at all. I mean, some people had been rather preferred that I be written anything but that.
That's changed now.
Let's see. I mean, they haven't shot me yet. So that's. But from these years, in mid-1980s, we had organized a European study group in the Nordic Summer University, and some people here are from that study group, like Iver Neumann, who is sitting here, and even although Sverre Järvel was part of it. Iver. And Ole Wever, that's sitting down there, and Anders Björnsson, who is sitting there, and Rune Ottosson, that also were at least some of these meetings. And on the other hand, I've been writing on submarines in Swedish waters, and a couple of people are going to speak about this, and Mattias Mossberg, who is sitting there, Swedish ambassador, who was Secretary General of the Submarine Inquiry. And so that is some people who could know at least a little bit about my past. And I guess that I leave it with this and give the floor to Åshild Kolås, who will be the chair, and check very, very disciplined when it comes to the speakers, that they don't say too much. And so and then it's Sverre Järvel and Iver Neumann that are going to say something.
Okay, is this on? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to be the chair here today, and I actually insisted that I would be the chair because otherwise it would be very, very gender biased. So I'm really looking forward to this, and to be the chair is, to get a little bit more power too. And also because this is actually a seminar under my project, which is Imagine Sovereignties, Frontiers of Statehood and Globalization. So this is actually, I have to say something about connecting it to my project, so Research Council and funding and all. It's kind of important sometimes. So that's why I insisted to put sovereignty in the title also. So actually I'm also partly responsible for the title. And with that, I'm going to leave. I'm supposed to read out these bios, which I will do. Maybe not every single word, but I'm going to start trying to do that soon. Sverre Järvel is a retired Norwegian diplomat who has been stationed in Germany and the US. He was responsible for policy planning at the ministry and played a significant role for the Norwegian-Russian relations from the early 90s. In the mid-1980s, he was sent to the US to the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, by Norwegian Foreign Minister Knut Frydenlund to find out what the Americans didn't tell him about the US Maritime Strategy, the US strategy for Northern Norway. And Järvel played an important role for the Barents Region initiative as a close advisor to Foreign Minister Thorvald Stoltenberg. He has been working with Stoltenberg for the recent study of security policy in the Nordic region. Welcome. Yes, you can.
Yeah, Ola, this is of course for you. A couple of years ago, they started a very interesting project in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Someone had discovered that a lot of things that happened in the 60s and 70s were not properly recorded in the archives. So they asked a colleague of mine, Jon Beck, who's not here today, I think, to go and talk to the persons who have been active and have them write their personal story, a paper on how they perceived it. One example is Norwegian support to liberation movements in Southern Africa. We passed on a lot of money, and of course we could not get any bank receipts, so very little was recorded. So that was one example where someone was asked to write his story. Now, I was asked to write about two things. First thing about the American forward maritime strategy in the 80s and Norwegian interests. And secondly, about the Barents Cooperation and the conflicts we had before that project was launched. I wrote this paper, and then Ola asked me to talk about these papers that I have delivered, give a sort of brief summary. And I'll do that when it comes to then this paper on the maritime strategy. Now I had to add this, I understand this is Chatham House rules. I should not be quoted on this, I think. Yes. No, anyway, in 1984, I think it was January 1984, Knut Frydenlund, who was then the chairman of the Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs in the Parliament and a former foreign minister, he invited some friends to his home to discuss US policy in the High North. I think I was invited first because I knew Frydenlund very well, and secondly because I was one of the not too many critical voices in the foreign ministry when it came to US policy. Now we had a discussion, and then I remember Knut Frydenlund, he said, I'm sort of worried, you know, I'm not quite sure. They inform us about everything. And this was a very nice discussion. I think one person that was mentioned at that meeting by Knut Frydenlund was Nils Petter Gleditsch, who had at that time applied for money in the ministry in order to study American files. And the civil servants agreed we should not give him any money. But then Frydenlund said, give him some money, I need that. But anyway, that was a very interesting discussion. Now, next day, I got a call from Knut Frydenlund, and he said, come down to the parliament. And then he said, I have a good idea. I want you to take 1 year's leave. And then he added, I know Henry Kissinger very well. And he has established this institute, Center for International Affairs at Harvard. And Kissinger always said you have to send some Norwegians to this center. So what I will do, I will ask the ministry if you can get 1 year's leave with full pay. And then you go to this center and try to answer the question, what are the Americans up to in the High North? And of course, I was very flattered, and I thought that was a brilliant idea to get salary and no work to do, actually. So I talked to the ministry, and they say everything is all right, but of course, this is not one for you. This has to be a new program, and you're the first part of this program. So you should not present this as sort of a solution for you. Now, anyway, I went to the Center for International Affairs. And the first thing I remember was that I had gotten a letter of recommendation from Knut Frydenlund as former Minister of Foreign Affairs. And I showed this to my colleagues, because it said give him all necessary support when it comes to this and these questions. But this had no impact, no effect at all. And then I understood that for these people from the US Navy at that time, minister, that had to do with religion, you know? So they could not understand why a minister came with recommendation. But anyway, what I got at this center was a very good network that included the key decision center of the Navy, people from the CIA, and this Harvard network was then extremely useful. Now, what did I do? I then started off talking to people. At John F. Kennedy School, you had the people who had developed this forward maritime strategy. That was the sort of key issue at this meeting with Frydenlund. So I went to talk to them, and they even got appointment for me down at New London, where all the submarine had their bases. So I talked to several commanders of US submarines and could ask them, what are you doing? And of course, Americans tell everything. So I think this was then, of course, extremely interesting. And I'll give some ideas of, you know, what sort of information I got. First, I talked to some of the Americans who have been to Norway to present this idea and asked them, did you get a Norwegian input? And they said, we met only one critical voice who really asked questions, and that he was Under Secretary of State in the Ministry of Defense, and that was Oddmund Hammerstad. That was the only critical voice. The other reactions we got, and then I think it was J. West who said that, who was then Under Secretary of State, now Under Secretary for Security, or the Vice Under Secretary for Security. He had been to Norway, and he said he was a bit surprised when he discussed this in Norway, because Norwegians, he said, tended to say that this is not a policy that has been discussed in NATO in Brussels. And then he added, this did not make a strong impression on my military colleagues, you know. And of course, it was a US strategy. Steve Miller, Professor Steve Miller at MIT was invited to some close conferences here in Oslo. And he got back and he said, it's very surprising because everyone is playing down this maritime strategy. Now, what was a maritime strategy? Actually, this was something that was launched in the presidential campaign in 1980 for the Republicans. What they said was that we have to have a more offensive policy towards the Soviet Union, and we have to have instruments to pursue this more offensive policy. And then, behind this, they had a very interesting concept, and that was the concept of horizontal escalation. Basically, what they said is, if we get a conflict, say in Iran, and we're not able to take care of US interests, then we have to threaten or hit the Soviets where they are very vulnerable. And where is that? That's, of course, the Kola Peninsula. So the idea of horizontal escalation was that you have problems somewhere that you cannot handle, and you bring the conflict into our area, the high north. Now, the second thing they needed was, of course, instruments. They needed a fleet that was able, you know, to pursue this policy, and they launched this program of a 600 ship navy, 600 ship fleet. Now, that was the sort of basic thinking. So it was very interesting then to notice that few Norwegians had asked questions about this, with the exception of Hammerstad, and I think Knut Frydenlund, who had talked to some of his friends. I think you know who that is, who also he thought played it down. Now, that was the sort of policy part of it. Now comes the next thing was, of course, what was happening when you were on the sort of military commander level. And then I had, I think, 10 interviews in New London with submarine commanders, and that was very interesting. I looked at my notes yesterday, and I written down that one of these commanders, he's talked a bit, and then he asked me, he said, we're going from Scotland through the Geo Cap, and we're going up on the coast to the Barents Sea. And then they said, is Norway a member of NATO? Or so I think that was rather surprising. But then, of course, I asked, what are you doing? How far do you move? How close do you get to the Soviet Union? And several of them said, of course, it's a question of incursions. We are in Soviet waters, in the White Sea. And I remember I said I was a bit surprised because, because you can ask Ola more about this later. But anyway, so I was surprised, and then I said, but you have to remember, there are different set of rules below sea level. There are no borders between sea levels. And of course, we intrude into the Black Sea in Soviet waters, and of course, they intrude our waters. I remember one incident in the ministry when, I think in the early 70s, Knut Frydenlund was informed that we had trapped a submarine in the Sognefjord. And I remember his remark, because he said, we have spent a lot of money to have these military people finding submarines, but we didn't expect them to trap one, you know. So what do we do? And I think his thinking was very much along the lines that there are different rules underwater. Anyway, you know, I don't know exactly what happened, but no, that was, how many minutes have I used?
10, and we have
5 more. All right. Then I see what I should not tell you. Now, this is, but anyway, I went back to Oslo, and then Knut Frydenlund wanted to have a report, and he always said, I want a brief report. Not many sentences, he said. He was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And then I said, my report is the following, that the Americans are outside northern Norway, or to some extent in northern Norway, not in order to protect our interests, but to protect their interests, which is, of course, not very surprising. But anyway, Knut Frydenlund said, go ahead and talk to more people and finish your report. And then I made a fatal mistake. Because at Harvard, you have every year at the Center for International Affairs, you have a prize. You can sort of have your paper nominated for a prize. And I thought, there are not many people working here, so I nominate my paper. And to my surprise, Sam Huntington called and said, you have won the prize, but then we have to publish the paper. So I immediately called Knut Frydenlund and said, what do I do? Well, Knut Frydenlund said, first you go to Trond Johansen. It was always Trond Johansen. And he tell you what you should not publish. And then you could publish the paper, but then you have to have a Norwegian version as well. And then I heard that the reactions in the ministry was not that forthcoming. You know, some of my good friends, Kjell Wibe, for instance, had been summoned by the American ambassador and asked, what is happening here? Why are your people asking all these questions? But anyway, I got the prize. And then this had to be published. I did that and made a Norwegian version of it, which was Spillet om Norskhavet. It was not very popular in the ministry. I must say it cost me, I think, a reduction in salary of 2 lønnsklasser probably. But anyway, but Knut Frydenlund, he was very keen on continuing this. And I'll ask some very specific questions. I remember one question that was an issue he met, I think, when he was head of the Standing Committee on Foreign Policy. That was on Brønnøysund flyplass. I think there was Oddbjørn know that much better, but I think it was some sort of request to have that airport airstrips, much longer airstrips. That was actually not very much needed in Brønnøysund. So I asked people at John F. Kennedy School, the planners, and they said this is very simple, because part of this forward strategy is in a time of crisis, we will move carrier groups, aircraft carriers, up to Lofoten area. And of course, they are very vulnerable. So if they are sort of attacked while the planes are in the air, they have to land somewhere, you know. And then Brønnøysund is very suitable. And Knut Frydenlund, he was, I think, thinking very much in terms of Norwegian base policy, or at least he felt he was not properly informed what it was all about. Yeah. Yes, well, then I should just look very carefully into the other paper, because it's a link actually about the other paper, and that was the Barents Region and the establishment of the Barents Region. Because in the paper and also in this book, when I wrote this, I was sort of very pessimistic. You know, here they are bringing war into the Norwegian area, and it could be very complicated. So I ended with a chapter when I talked about the long-term perspective. Perhaps could we use Northern Norway as a bridge to the east and not as a barrier? And so that was actually the first steps in the direction of the Barents region. Still some minutes?
No, not really.
Then I should just look back 2 sentences. How does this forward maritime strategy look when you're looking back? Because nothing happened. It was not a problem. And the main reason, I think, was, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Cold War ended, you know, so actually there was no need for sort of horizontal escalation. But when we look back on the documents from this period, it's a new concept that we were not very much aware of, and that was the concept of deception. The Americans had this policy, this deception committee, and the idea of deception was actually based on the main thinking behind US policy, that you should force the Russians to arm beyond means. And of course that was what Reagan actually succeeded with. And so I think this forward maritime strategy was partly part of that policy in order to give the Russians the impression that they were more endangered than they really were. I could quote a lot of examples of this deception policy, and Ola can do it later. One example that was mentioned by Clay, who was the head of this committee, was that they sent destroyers up outside the Finnmark, and these destroyers sent out all the signals of an aircraft carrier. And the Russians, of course, and the Russian submarines thought an aircraft carrier was moving close to Murmansk. I remember from my time in the ministry, we had these American military exercises from Keflavik, where they attacked Troms, of course, giving the Russian an impression that we can as well attack the Kola Peninsula. Now, so what I'm saying actually, and that is important conclusion, that I've changed my view since this book was written 20 years ago, in the sense that the American thinking was perhaps a bit different than I thought that time. It was less deterrence, and it was more sort of forcing the Russian to arm beyond means. And I mention this because Knut Frydenlund, when I got back, he became Minister of Foreign Affairs, and then he had a statement in the parliament on this policy. And then he did say something of what Oddmund said. He said, I'm a bit worried because more American engagement could force stronger Russian engagement, and then our low tension policy could be endangered. And he had a point. But on the other hand, that was the idea of Reagan, to force the Russian to arm, which then basically led to the collapse and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Thank you.
I completely forgot to mention the title of the session, which is Overcoming the East-West Divide, Geopolitics, Sovereignty and Regions. And I think that Yves is going to talk about something to do with geopolitics and region. And Professor Yves Neumann is a research professor at NUPI and the Montague Burton Professor of International Relations of London School of Economics, specializing in social theory, historical international relations, and the study of Russian and Norwegian foreign policy and diplomacy. Yeah, I think that's probably enough.
All that.
Yes, all that.
Ola, thanks for inviting me to this session. One of the best books that Ola has written, and that is saying quite a lot, is a book that nobody's read. You know, sometimes I wonder whether there isn't an inverted relation between how good a book is and how few people read it. And that it was an essay, a collection of essays called Den svarta duvan. And the key thing about the book was not only that it was about hope against hope, that it was about the east-west divide and black doves flying above and across walls, but it was also that it was such an elegant way of bringing two different groups of people into discussion, or rather two different worlds, two different fields into discussion. The military and the intellectuals. And you are certainly entitled to ask. Do we have a person for this? I'm not a hologram. Thank you. How am I doing that? Is it all right? Yeah. So, two groups of people, military and intellectuals. And as a student of Russia, I can tell you that this is not an obvious thing. In Russia, if you're an intellectual, you hate military people, and if you're a military person, you hate intellectuals. And there are very few exceptions. And sometimes we think that this is just Norway. This is a consensus society. This happened all by itself. Well, I wonder. Because one of Ola's favorite stories from the late 80s, and a story that I've heard told by other people as well, was about how Ola and a number of a small group of other researchers decided that we need a dialogue with the military. Here we are spending our lives studying security policy, and we don't speak to the people who actually do this stuff. It's about time to start a dialogue. So they planned this meeting, and if memory serves, it was at the Nobel Institute, or was it at Felix, or somewhere?
It was a Clausewitz seminar, I think, and it started at NUPI for a while, and then after having the seminar, we went to Felix to have a beer.
Exactly, and you see, one of the sort of reasons why I mentioned den svarta duvan and the elegant aspect of the svarta duvan is that one aspect of Ola's writings that we tend to forget about is the aesthetic element. He writes beautifully, and I can tell you that it takes a lot of time. I look at my ilk, people who live off writing, and very few people write beautifully. Some write like this as if they haven't really thought through what language is at all. Ola writes beautifully. So he has an eye for the aesthetic. So for this meeting, where intellectuals and military were supposed to meet one another, courtesy of Ola Tunander, the intellectuals got together and thought, how are we going to dress? You know, what about our appearances? What are we going to do to get into a dialogue with these people? And they decided, well, military people are very formal people. So we will don suits. We will find ties. And Ola is from a generation that doesn't really believe in the tie. But, you know, they found ties, and there they went. And as it turned out, the military had the same kind of debate. How are we going to dress when we're meeting these people? And they decided, well, heavy sweaters. That must be the way to go. So these people were sitting around the table, 7 people at either side. And on the one side, there were 7 people in jumpers. That would be the military people. And then there would be several people in 3-piece suits. That would be the intellectuals. And when I look around the room now, Ola, I see that both groups are still here, but they're all camouflaging. They look the same, right? And whether that is because of your pioneer insight when it comes to starting the dialogue, or whether it is because they know so much about PSYOPs once they've read your writings, I don't know, but here is the result. And one of the reasons why Ola went into this was also, as it's so isn't it, a reading experience. I mean, we write about what we write about because we're interested in substance, but we also do so because we come across books. And you can tell a lot about a man or a woman from what kind of books have inspired them. Most people have never been inspired by a book. That's why they're so boring. And then certain people are interested in different ways, among other things, because they've been inspired in different ways by different books. And in Ola's case, Rudolf Kjellén is one such person. And Rudolf Kjellén shares with almost every other eminent Nordic intellectual the fate that he is much better known abroad than in his own country. If memory serves, his basic book, there are a number of books, but his basic book went into 25 different editions in Germany, even when Karl Haushofer was alive, and it must have reached the 30s before it ran out. I've never come further than 2 editions of my books, so I see that I have another sort of way to go in Germany. Well, yeah, but times have changed, Ola. I hate to tell you this, but times have changed. And Kjellén's basic thing is that he does not want to go about geopolitics in a mechanical way. He wants to factor in cultural and linguistic aspects. And the way he does it, typical of his time, is that he's talking about polities as being organic. And one of the key things about the geopolitical debates in the 80s and 90s was this debate about in what degree geopolitics should be thought about as mechanic, in what degree it was simply the lay of the land and the sea that actually decided, or whether one should also take into consideration how the different agents represented one another. And in this case, Ola and I stood at separate sides, because although Ola was very interested in Kjellén, he came down on the importance of the lay of the land. A skerry in the sea is more important than what you think about the people that you sort of are watching in your periscope, I think, would be your position. And Ola has been, if you look at the international literature on geopolitics, you will find that in the key publications about them, there will usually be a chapter about Rudolf Kjellén, and that chapter will be written by Ola. If memory serves, you even got your professorial competence because you wrote a paper on Rudolf Kjellén for Review of International Studies. What you didn't know was that I was one of the referees for that paper. But I suppose there's a reason why I'm here. Now, the substance of that perspective. Kjellén was big on the triangle. Triangle in those days, the Nordic politics had to be understood in terms of a game between 3 poles, Britain to the west, Germany to the south, Russia to the east. And he used this for a number of purposes, among other things, in order to insist that Norway shouldn't leave Sweden in 1905, because what was inside that triangle had to stand together or die separately, or hang together or hang separately, as the saying goes, right? So whether Ola's 30 years here in Norway has been about trying to win Norway back for Sweden is, of course, a hypothesis that would be in the spirit of Ola's PSYOPs thinking. I don't know. I mean, you can comment on that later on. I don't think so, and the reason is that he actually, when he found a place to live, it was near Karl Berners Platz. And after a while, you know, he asked people, you know, who are all these people? You know, Joachim, Jørgen Løvland, Karl Berner, because in that particular area, all the names are from the people who were in charge of taking Norway out of Sweden and actually sort of trying to get it up and running as a state. And Ola didn't know, so I suppose if it's a PSYOPs, sort of, it's a very deep PSYOP. So maybe it's so deep that you don't even know about it yourself. Okay? But the perspective of the triangle and the tug-of-war between Britain, Russia, Germany had a lot to offer us, because this was a period where intellectuals had a short span of time, maybe 4, 5, 6 years, where everybody was so flabbergasted about what happened in the world that even intellectuals had a chance of saying something that was actually heard. Then that closed down, people decided what to do, and of course then we were no longer interesting, because if you think on a grand scale, you have to be there for specific occasions, right? Trotsky is the best one on this, you know. There are certain times when history is just condensed and moves very, very fast, so that 50 years have been standing there and waiting to happen in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, right? And that was a period like that. We may be getting there again quite soon. And the major thing for Ola, I think, was that Russia should not be crammed so much that it would no longer be a part of the triangle, that they would come back. I remember we talked about this once, and we decided that Russia was like a lobster changing shells. That you know, if we didn't kill it outright, which would not be a good idea, it would sort of grow a new shell and come back. And I think that Ola was, we agreed on that, and it was quite obvious at the time. And I think the expression you used var det kan man räkna ut med häcken, which cannot really be translated into either English and Norwegian, thank God. But here we are. That's what happened. The big question is, of course, whether it would have happened anyway. So I think we could go back to Chilean, Ola, and write about how things do not change even on the cultural level. And the reason for that is not, I think, what Chilean said, that we have organic polities. I don't think that's true at all. But the path dependence of history is absolutely stunning. And when a country is faced with a crisis, the basic impulse, it's not always followed, but the basic impulse is to turn back on itself and its own history. So I just went back, like we do now, to what I worked on in that period in order to update it. A book on how Russia has represented Europe through the centuries. And the stunning thing is that the about turn that we've had over the last 25 years, from looking at Europe as something from which we could learn, as the Russians put it in the early 90s, a return to civilization. We are back to where we were in the 19th century. Europe has lost itself. Europe has lost God. Europe is decadent. Europe is a gang of what then was called homosexuals and are now called gays and pedophile and pederasts. And Russia is the newborn hope from which everything that has to do with renewal will come. So some people look at what has happened in Russia over the last 25 years and they see something new, something ridiculous, of course, when Russia says that only the Christianity that we have kept burning can save Europe. Well, fuck you. I mean, you've spent 70 years being military atheists, and now you're coming here to teach us about Christ? I mean, that's a bit much, isn't it? I'm sorry, we shouldn't swear during a public presentation, but this is off the record anyway. My time is just about up. Not out. Time cannot be out. It's always here.
Okay.
But I think your perspective, Ola, that we are rounding on ourselves and that there is a permanence below these sort of surface changes is coming back to haunt us. And I think that in your dotage, as it were, when you are sort of looking at your otium, as you are now, you should spend it on going back to Chilean and the triangle and tell us what this looks like now that Russia is back in a weaker but recognizable form. Thank you.
Yeah, Ola, you can go ahead right away. Yeah.
Thank you. Aha. Ja, ja. So thank you very much. And we were in 1991. No, start earlier. Sorry. In 1986, we had a seminar in Stockholm, a Nordic Summer University seminar. And after the seminar, we had a party in our kitchen and in Stockholm, because I was living in Stockholm. I moved in '87 to Oslo. And I asked Sverre about this horizontal escalation idea. And he told much more than he was supposed to tell. And I thought that was good. So that was also important for writing my doctoral thesis on US Maritime Strategy. And also that he actually did the service for our wedding once in 1998 in Bonn, because we had to marry at neutral territory, and it could neither be Sweden nor Norway or nor China, so to speak. But then in 1991, Sverre organized a trip to the Baltic states, and Baltic republics. It was a summer 1991, and we went to Estonia and Latvia, and it was the International Affairs Institute, in the Nordic International Affairs Institute and the Nordic Peace Research Institute, and some of us are here. And when we came to Latvia, and it was the chairman of the leader of the Conservative Party, and he said that the policy that they had was to treat the Russians as bad as they could, so they get rid of them. And the representative from the Nordic Council said that any membership in the Nordic Council is not in the pipeline. And but that was, you could see already at that time that it was a kind of tension. You could easily see that it would be tension between the new Russia and the West. And it would what happened in the former Soviet Union and so on would be very significant, actually. So I think that the trouble with all the NATO enlargement, you could say, and so on, was not very successful. I mean, the NATO enlargement had created a lot of trouble, and we could now see what happens, and we could now see also the mentality, as Iver mentioned, that have changed in Russia, not to the best, so to speak. In what Sverre brought up about the maritime strategy is now the Americans are willing to speak out a little bit more than before, and they were selling it to Norway as a kind of defense of all the sea lines of communications and so on. That was deception to the Norwegians, so to speak. I mean, it was partly right, and every deception has to be partly right, so to speak. But it was primarily to start to sink the strategic submarines from the first 5 minutes of a war. And John Lehman, who was the Secretary of Navy, he said that we had calculated that we could eliminate the Northern Fleet in 1 week. And the Russians calculated that we could eliminate the Northern Fleet in 1 week. And it also started to filter down in the NATO. But that was, when we look today back to on this time, and you had quite a few submarines, I mean, maybe 180 or something like that in the Northern Fleet. I don't remember exactly, 150 or something. And now it's 30, I think, or something. So you could say that the threat from the east is much weaker now than it was in the 1980s. But on the other hand, it's absolutely, at that time, the West were very, very much stronger than the Soviet Union. And so it has, what has happened the last 2 years, I would say, is very much PSYOPs and deception. And that's what we are going to continue with, I guess. I think I'm...
Yes, you're actually 2 minutes late.
Yes, I was thinking that you should, cut me off.
No, not you, Ola, not you.
Okay,
There's
okay,
special
okay.
rules for you. So I don't know when I'm going to read your bio now.
No, someone already knows it. Maybe.
Yeah, it's such a shame. It was so well written. You've written it yourself.
Okay.
And as Eva said, your style is
Yes.
very nice.
But
So
there are some seconds for questions. Or
some
something.
seconds for questions.
My name is Anders Helbus. It's a very interesting presentation of Sverige. Kan alle høre meg?
Ja.
Flott. The problem is, or was, that it was not so that it was not sure US forces will come to this area, to Norway. The problem was that they will come before we ask them to come. And that was a vital question. And it's wonder why it was so little discussion in Norwegian newspapers about that. No researchers wrote anything. No one wrote. I wrote an article in Aftenposten in the 80s. I think I was the first who wrote about it. And my sources was in Washington and found a lot of congressional records. And there the strategy was very good presented. And I wrote an article about that. Who answered that article? One person. It was my boss in the Norwegian Academy, General Tønne Huitfeldt. And he was very much against that, my writings. No one else wrote about that. So, and that is typical for very important Norwegian security political questions. Where are the researchers? Where are the people to discuss such problems? I ask you about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe I forgot one thing that was important, and that was Pelle Nero, who's standing up there, who is a British from Britain, and who found a lot of archive material on the early 80s, late 70s. And the British Defense Ministry and the State Department, or the Foreign Ministry, were furious about the Norwegians. They were, and not least Knut Frydenlund, who was more or less unacceptable, and also they were thought, for example, that Sverre Jervel was a troublesome, and he didn't even try to hide that he was a bit left-wing, actually. So that was a yeah, no, I
I'm slightly off topic. I don't know about later today, but the British and Americans' policy to hello. The Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan wanted to bury the Soviet Union, and the Scandinavians and the West Germans wanted to coexist with the Soviet Union, and the Norwegians apparently, especially Jürgen Holst, wanted to run this thing called Nordpolitik, which was basically having a low-tension relationship with the Soviet Union, while West Germany, even under Helmut Schmidt, who is supposed to have been a hawk, wanted to trade and deal with the Soviet Union. And I think that the geopoliticians would say that the American, formerly the English when they had an empire, but later the Americans were terrified that the great continental powers would get together. And their great fear was that West Germany would give its technological know-how to the Russians and sort of strike become an economic bloc. And that was symbolized by this pipeline politics of the early 1980s. The Americans did everything to destroy the burgeoning pipeline funded by the German banks and built by American and German technology. So the hostility between Helmut Schmidt and Reagan grew to enormous levels. And Reagan said to Mitterrand, this man is a zero right in front of Reagan. The allegations that Schmidt was actually ousted from power by bribes to the German Liberal Party, who left the coalition, and that was that out of the equation. Olof Palme in Sweden also received enormous pressure because of his policy. Carl Bildt said Palme has bought this Norwegian infection, and he's trying to run this peace policy with the German, which the Germans abandoned after Schmidt went. But you Norwegians, I'd like to talk to you if any of you have the experience of the early 1980s, because, as Ola said, they're very critical of the Norwegians. And then Brundtland came to power in 81, and that was slightly okay, but Brundtland was under enormous pressure from her left wing. So when Kåre Willoch came into power in September 1981, Norway was sorted out. So by mid-82, Palme was the only North European leader still advocating Ostpolitik, or September 82, and that's of course when the submarine intrusion started. So I think the thesis is that you put diplomatic pressure on the Scandinavians and the Germans, and if that failed, you started doing these psychological operations. So if any of you have any insights into this, come talk to me later. I'd love to hear from you, because I've got all the diplomatic reports, and it's unflattering because the Norwegians think they have this special relationship with the British, but the British are behaving in a frankly sort of neo-colonial way towards the Norwegians, and I can't think that's a very good for Anglo-Norwegian relations.
Coming close.
Yeah, I think that we could, for health and safety reasons, we can have a 10-minute break now, and then please be back on time.
Here to go through the history of the submarine incursions in Sweden, that would maybe carry a little bit too long, but just to say very, very briefly, they started in the beginning of the 80s. It became a political issue, and basically in 1981, of course, we had the whiskey on the rocks, which was there for everyone to see. In 1982, we had the so-called Horsfjärden incident involving a lot of submarines. And then the issue went on throughout the 80s and into the beginning of the 90s. There have been 3 major Swedish government investigations into the issue. The first one was in 1983, right after the Horsfjärden incident, and that focused on the Horsfjärden incident, and it came to the conclusion that this was all the Soviets. That was Warsaw Pact submarines, and Warsaw Pact meant the Soviet Union. Then the issue continued. It wasn't quite settled. The debate continued in Sweden, and in 1995, a new government investigation was appointed. And they worked for a year, and they came to the conclusion that the conclusions of the 1983 Commission did not hold water. 1983, they had come to 4 what they called different chains of evidence, and the 95 Commission showed that none of these chains held water. So was the issue then settled? Not really. The debate continued, but sort of rather calm until Weinberger was on record saying these things. Now, of course, the first thing that happened after Weinberger had said that was that people like Carl Bildt called Weinberger and talked to him, and then went out to the Swedish press and said that, oh, Weinberger, he didn't know what he was talking about, and he hardly knew where Sweden was, and this sort of thing, which was, in short, an operation to sort of degrade what he had been saying. And only a few weeks after, Swedish television interviewed the British Minister of the Marine at the time, Sir Keith Speed, who basically confirmed what Weinberger had been saying. And they both said things like, basically, of course we were there. But, they said, never without prior consultations, Navy to Navy, with the Swedish Navy. Now there was a small problem in a Swedish, and I'm not going to go too much into our own problems here, but this is very much a Swedish problem, and I have to share this with you, and that is that the Swedish government was not informed. So here we have a situation which is rather delicate, maybe. Well, so that's when we started working in this government commission against this background to look into what had really happened, and both from a military and but also from a political point of view. And that is where I met Ola Tunander, who was called in as expert in this commission by Ambassador Rolf Ekéus, who was heading the commission. I was asked to be Secretary General. And Rolf Ekéus and Ola Tunander gradually brought me into this complex of very intriguing issues. I had no particular views on my own when I took this job. I was at the time Director of Policy Planning in our ministry, and had been serving in Moscow, as you said. I've also had the Soviet desk. I was actually on the Soviet desk until October 1981, when Whiskey on the Rocks ran aground or landed in Sweden. But I was not part of that at all. Well, we had, with the help of Ola, we started to ask a number of questions going a little bit further than other investigations had done, looking into very much what pointed to the west, and then what pointed to the east, and maybe not very much. We were also focusing mainly on Hårsfjärden, but not only on Hårsfjärden. Then we also had to bring in another military expert, an Admiral Göran Wallén, who had a central role during Hårsfjärden, and who had very good connections and knew everything about this. The only thing was that he had, from the beginning, made up his mind that the task of the commission was one, and that was to prove that we were dealing with Soviet incursions and nothing but Soviet incursions. So you could say we had a sort of wide-ranging range of views in this commission, which maybe also is shown in the result. The result was this book here, Perspektiv på ubåtsfrågan, and we came to the conclusion that that it could not be excluded that the West was also involved. Now, already that was quite a piece for the Swedish public opinion to take. There was an outcry, and people like Carl Bildt and others cut us down completely. We were saved by Ola. Ola Tunander at the same time published a book of his own called Hårsfjärden, the secret war against Sweden, the secret submarine war against Sweden. And that meant that in this debate in Sweden, he was placed here, and sort of the Navy and others were here, and we were somewhere in the middle. So Ola had to take a lot of flack for that. We were on one level. On one level, we were slightly surprised, but on another level, we were very grateful to you for this, Ola. Let's see, I have a few more minutes, I hope. Well, the debate continued in Sweden after this. A number of things happened. There were similar government investigations with a larger security policy focus in other countries. But let me say first that we also had another government investigation that we carried out in parallel, and that was about the Swedish security policy during the Cold War from 1969 to 89. We decided to do the work so that we did the submarine issue first, we published that, and then we continued with the wider issues. Now, in working with the wider issues, we got better access to the military archives, or wider access to the military archives. One of the problems with this was that the military intelligence, where the archives for the submarine issue are located, never let us into their archives. They always, all the time, kept control, in spite of the fact that the directives for our investigation said specifically we shall have access to all information. Now, the word shall in Swedish in this context is basically an order from the government to us to get access to all information. Well, that didn't happen. They kept control. But when we were continuing to investigate the wider security policy, we also got access to other archives, such as the private archives of the commander-in-chief, of the head of the army, of these people, and others. And in this work, we discovered also a few more things about the submarine issue. And just to let me take one example. We discovered from 1982, just a few months before the Hårsfjärden incident, we discovered two incursions, or reports about two incursions. One from February 1982 outside of Utö, outer part of Stockholm archipelago, where it says very clearly that because the submarine had been observed and there was a drawing about it, that this looks very much like a West German submarine type 206. Now, would such a report come into the public? Never. It was given double secret stamps, which means in the Swedish system 70 years, and it was given to 3 people in the whole system, and then never heard of again. And in the statistics, it was taken into the statistics which were officially presented as statistics of Soviet incursions. There was another one like that on the west coast, and all before Hårsfjärden. This was never shared with in wider. So that was just an example of what we found. We had, maybe I should just share with you a couple, how many minutes? Just a couple of minutes more. Okay. The debate continued, and I published a book when I left the Foreign Service. I also published a book about what had come up. We had there was also an interest from Arte, from Swedish television. Swedish television showed a series of programs which showed technical evidence pointing to a Western submarine. And so the picture was getting clearer and clearer. And Ola continued his works, and thanks not least to him, we have now a much clearer picture of, if not to say a rather good idea of what actually happened, both as to the motives, the capacities, the type of submarines, and also about the Swedish cover-up efforts. Now, I have mainly regarded this issue up until a couple of years ago as a historical issue in Sweden. And I was very keen to keep it that way as well, because the moment you enter politics into it, it becomes much more difficult to get any further. However, realities present themselves. And the last couple of years, I don't know if you have, how much of this has reached Oslo, but since 2014, in 2015, we have had new incidents in Sweden. And in 2014, there was a submarine hunt, you could say, during about a week in Stockholm archipelago. And what triggered this was an observation, not an optical observation, but it was an observation in the military system from the naval sensors. They didn't say at the time quite what it was, but they said that this was an absolutely certain observation, and it was classed as the highest class, a proven submarine. A year later, they had to, the Defense Forces published the press release saying that this decisive piece of evidence turned out to have another explanation. But it doesn't change our view. Other evidence that or other indications from other sources point in that direction. Now, but what they haven't told you, and I'll tell you, but and it's probably coming out soon in Sweden, is that the initial observation was a Swedish submarine. Now, of course, we'll see if that comes out. We had long articles, everybody was out there blaming the Soviets at the end of 2014. Recently, it was released that there was another incident in 2015 that was also regarded as another Soviet submarine. The military didn't say so. They don't have to say so because the press does the job for them. And they just say that no nationality can be determined. The press is all over there. Soviets are back, that sort of thing. Now, that one, they know. I have from very good sources, I can't go into that any further, that they know it was not the Russian submarine. One of the two Russian submarines that are in the Baltic, They know that it was a NATO submarine, but that has not come out either. We shall have a few interesting weeks to come in Sweden. And let me finish just by saying that this is important because it comes right in the middle of a renewed debate about Swedish membership in NATO. And this is being used as material to show the Swedish public how dangerous the Russians are. They're back. And so there you go. Now I want in conclusion just to say now that it's my hope that Ola, now that when you retire, that this will not lead to silence, but that you will continue working on these issues so that we will get full clarity about the past and that a false picture of the past is not being used to lead us astray again in Sweden. Thank you very much.
So we're going to have a video, and Ola will take over now, temporarily.
Ja, kanske. Praktiskt taget. Ja, just det. Kan ni höra? Ja. Nej?
Höra.
Måste jag göra någonting?
Ja,
Jaha.
såna.
Ja, okej. Den person som skulle snacka nu hamnar på operationsbordet. Så han ersätts då av mig. Och, men också av en liten filmsekvens. Och då har jag lagt in ett par, och det är från Artes film, alltså Dirk Pohlman som sitter där. Som gjorde en film för den fransk-tyska kanalen Arte som sändes för ett år sedan. Sorry, okay. Sorry, I didn't. Yeah, yes, sorry. Yeah, but he knows it already, so I don't have to repeat it. But what we start with just a few seconds of this documentary from Arte. There, John Lehman speaks about the Deception Committee. And we could just start now and see what. And this, we better. It's interesting here because I think this man is known.
Convinced Reagan
in
Norway,
Norway,
in addition to the big military buildup, which had already been committed to and agreed, that there should be a major effort with what some came to call the Deception Committee, to, while we would build the NATO military capability to look like it's to be 10 feet tall, the use of deception could make it appear to the Soviets to be 20 feet tall.
No, because okay. So that was very short, but two things there. I think it was Kjakan Sundsteby who was sitting there together with Casey, and he's famous in Norway, not in Sweden. And secondly, John Lehman was Secretary of Navy, and he knew about this Deception Committee. That was it was the CIA director or director of Central Intelligence, William Casey, who was the chair, and then it was 3 more people at least, and one was Dick Allen, who was a national security advisor, and then it was the deputies of State and Defense. And they were running all the very secret deception operations. For example, the Star Wars, that some of you remember. And also they flooded the Soviet system with fake computer chips, with the Trojan horses, this was already in early 1980s. And which, for example, led to a huge explosion in Siberia pipeline, where they came to the conclusion that this corresponded to a 3 kiloton burst. And they thought first it was a nuclear explosion, but it was actually a pipeline explosion that was triggered by the CIA in sending fake computer chips into the Soviet system, because they the Soviets were smuggling high technology, and the CIA controlled this pipeline for smuggling high technology. So it was and the third point was the submarines, to play Russians in Swedish waters. And what we have, and also I could say that John Lehman said that this was decided already before Reagan entered office. Reagan decided two major things before he came to office. One was the build-up of the 600-ship Navy, the huge military build-up, and secondly, the deception committee that would fool the Russians totally, and also the Swedes, and the West German Social Democrats and so on. But we could continue. This is from 1981, and they are going out to the Whiskey submarine that stranded outside the naval base in Karlskrona. And we could just continue. And this was in Karlskrona.
Jag tog mig fram och när jag hade kommit in på Båstadfjärden en bit så drog jag ner farten. Och då dök det plötsligt upp 100 meter framför mig ett grönsvart ubåtsskrov. Och då identifierade vi hade sån identifieringskort ombord i den här båten, och det var en whisky. Den saken var fullständigt klar. En rysk ubåt.
And we could stop. Okay. And for Carl Andersson, who is not here now, but speaking there, he was the chief of staff at the naval base and acting commander of the naval base also for some time. And he went out to check. He got this report about this Russian submarine, or a submarine, and in a fjord that you could not go with a submarine really, because it was so shallow. And so he thought it was very strange, but it was a Russian submarine there. And he spoke with this guy, Avrukevich, who was not the captain of the submarine, but was the chief of staff of the submarine brigade. And it turned out, after talking and so on, that he actually was running the submarine. He was navigating it. It was not the captain. And he was running into Swedish waters, and it was huge conflict in the submarine between the captain, who was a very young guy, who was the youngest captain, and it was his first trip as a captain. So he totally had to rely on Avrukevich. And we could continue a little bit. And this is the Captain Gushin. And this is all from the film of Arte.
Man måste ju rädda på grund. Det finns ingen chans för henne att gå runt någonstans. Jag menar, hon var ju fast i proppen där. Så att använda henne som någon slags jävla underrättelsekälla var ju helt korkat. Man kunde ju chartrat en svensk fiskebåt, satt svensk flagga på den, tuffa kring och lodat och mätt och hur mycket som helst. Men att ta en ubåt, det är ju absolut det sämsta flytetyget. För det är någonting som alertar folk.
Ubåten gick upp på land i princip alltså då. Ja, jag kan ta lite paus här. Och det var, i Sverige så blev det en konflikt mellan de som menar att det här var en it became a conflict between the people who thought this was a conscious intrusions for as a spy operation, while, for example, Carl Anderson thought that it was just strange. Why you could use a fishing boat or whatever? You don't go into a fjord with a submarine where you couldn't dive. I mean, it was and it turned out also that he saw that they have a sea chart, a map, that was, he was almost sure it was a Swedish top secret military map of the area. And but on that map, it says that it's the fjord is for 4.5 meters depth, and the submarine is 5 meters deep when it goes on surface. So it was something, pretty strange on the whole thing. You can, and it was so narrow that it was very difficult to turn around the boat also. And if it hadn't hit this rock and was able to go a little bit further, it would be sitting in the sand a couple of minutes later. So you could.
Ja. Jo, det var fastslaget. Jag fick uppgift på att följande personer ska förhöras. Gurshin och NO, alltså vakthavande officeren, och det var den det var, va? Och det råkade vara besättningen. Och sedan skulle utkiken och rogängaren förhöras. Det var de personerna. Inga andra fick förhöras.
Yeah. This is from the film this is the submarine. I got it declassified for the film. And this
in front of the propellers there is no sediment wall, which means that the submarine had tried to get higher up on the rock. It wanted to sit there. And also it had moved the submarine 50 degrees, so the whole submarine was sitting on the rock, so it wouldn't slide off.
So this is not real. This is this is drawings, yes. But the point is that it goes up, and it tries to go even higher up, and then you have a sand wall behind the propellers. So it actually, someone in the submarine wanted to sit there. They went in, and this someone was this chief of staff, Avrokevich, and he was not, and the chief of staff of the naval base was not allowed to question him. So this started to make a pretty strange development, and the commander of the naval base disappeared. I mean, the Swedish the Karlskrona naval base. He locked himself into the room. He was unavailable. And the hours before this happened, when they found the submarine, 2 US naval officers turned up at the naval base and wanted to have a briefing about the readiness on the base. And they were there early in the morning. I mean, and they had arrived the day before. They had arrived the day before the submarine went aground. And they had a meeting with the commander of the naval base. And before his regular working hours. So they went there, and early in the morning. So when Carl Anderson arrived at 8 o'clock, the U.S. attaché and his deputy was standing waiting for him to give the briefing about the readiness on the base. And of course the readiness was not so good because he didn't even know that it was a Russian submarine sitting there. So it's so of course Sweden needed something that happened, and that was what all these submarines were about, I think. And it was the Americans had sonars along the Swedish coast from the late 60s, early 70s. And my friend Robert Bathurst, who was Chief Naval Intelligence, US Chief Naval Intelligence Europe in the early 70s, he received the information from these sonars. And he was very afraid that I should write about it, actually, and so on. I wrote sonars along the Scandinavian coasts with a plural, S, which made him worried and said that I should not accept polygraph tests and so on. But S means not just Norway, but also Sweden and the Baltic. And then this question could come up. But recently, Bobby Inman, who was his source on this issue, also on the Swedish, because Bobby Inman was deputy CIA, but he was also chief naval intelligence, and he was attaché in Sweden, or assistant attaché in Sweden in the 60s. He had arranged for this sonar along the Swedish coast, so they knew exactly where all the Soviet submarines were, and to support these sonar systems, they had to have some kind of small submarines, Western submarines. And Robert said that he didn't want to go into specifics, so to speak. But I spoke with another guy who said that these were small foreign special purpose submarines. And I asked if they were Italian, and he said yes. And they went with these Italian submarines on merchant ships, he said, and into Swedish waters, and they dropped the submarines, went and carried the cargo to the harbor that they should, and then went back and picked up the submarines. And what happened in the 1980s was just to let these submarines show off a little bit, to show their sails, their periscopes and something, and it became, and the Swedes became hysterical, and Europeans, and it totally destroyed the idea from Swedish social democrats, Olof Palme and so on, because his idea was to have a kind of common security dialogue with Moscow, and this was totally broken. You couldn't do it. I mean, it was a, and also you had senior naval officer, or not very senior, let's say, it was Hans von Hofsten, who was a commander. He believed really that Olof Palme had let the submarines out, and there was also one guy who called Carl Gustaf Östling, who was argued that Olof Palme was a traitor. He had let the submarines out, and firstly he hadn't done that because it was done on the level of some admirals that did that. But but they had meetings that they planned killing of Olof Palme, for example. I mean, their superior, Kai Holmberg, said that they hadn't decided on any specific way to kill him, and but they were preparing, killing of Olof Palme. Then who did it? Another thing. But the submarines played a very significant role in this case. So it was a bit dirty deception, and when I asked a British submarine captain who said that yes, we did that and so on, and we did these operations, and also along the North Swedish coast, and we had the Porpoise and Oberon class submarines that also mentioned by the Navy Minister Keith Speed and so on, and I asked, but why couldn't this be declassified today? And this was in 90s, late 90s. And he said, you don't know, maybe it will be a new Cold War. And then they will be useful again, as Matthias spoke about a few minutes ago, in 2014. And the Swedish media and public became almost as crazy as in 1980s. And it's used on very clearly, purposely, to control Swedish public opinion and so on. I don't know what the chair is. I don't know how much time I have. And
I think you should. Do you have more video? No.
This is end of it.
This
yes.
end video. Then I think you already spent your comments, so we can go to the questions.
Yes.
Hallo? Jeg har dessverre ikke noen stemme, for jeg er forkjølt, men jeg ble så fristet til å fortelle en liten historie. På begynnelsen av 80-tallet så ble jeg kjent med George Kennan. Han var jo tidligere Moskva-ambassadør, og ble etter hvert en fredsengel, og fikk Einsteins fredspris for å ha foreslått halvering av interkontinentale ballistiske raketter. I'm sorry. Maybe I will have a try. George Kennan, you might know him. He was married to a Norwegian and had a summer house down at Kristiansand. And I used to visit him a few summers. And I also visited him in Princeton. And we had all long debates about the nuclear arms race as a former vice president of IPPNW. And he loved to sail. And he had the Swedish boat Allebergrassi. And he used to cross over to Sweden from Kristiansand. And I was sitting in the hammock in his garden, and then he said to me, you know, Dagmar, when I sail towards Sweden, or even towards Norway, I see this skärgård, these gray small islands. And if I was not the one I am, I would have believed it would have been a submarine. But I can assure you about one thing, they are not Russian.
Maybe I should say also that what happened in the very big submarine hunt that changed Sweden really was in October 1982. And the commission that Matthias Mossberg mentioned that came after was in April 83. In June 83, the new Finnish president, Koivisto, went to Moscow on his first trip and met with Andropov. And Andropov told him, tell the Swedes that they should sink every submarine that enters their waters, and they will see for themselves what comes up. And he told Olof Palme in August, in connection with the was it World Championship or something like that, some athletics something, and after that Olof Palme never pointed to the Russians, because he realized, and Koivisto said that he believed that this was provocations, and that he wrote afterwards also, and used my material actually also, and Olof Palme was then criticized harshly by some people in Sweden, and Lennart Bodström, who was a foreign minister, said that if it's a ski tracks through the garden, you couldn't just point to the neighbor because of that. And he had to leave office because of this. The campaign against him was so strong that Olof Palme had to sacrifice his foreign minister. And some people were extremely active, and they changed the Swedish government and policy very much. And also after Richard Birch, who was a Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, I think he was interviewed by Swedish TV about Olof Palme and so on. And then he said, it's after, he should say after Palme, but he misspoke. So he said after Sweden, there was no longer any kind of major criticism of US policy. So that was so he considered Sweden to be a pain in the ass. And when Palme disappeared, this disappeared also. And Sweden disappeared because it wasn't important any longer. Okay.
Well, one thing is that which no one mentions, Carl Bildt was absolutely central in this demonization campaign of Palme. He was feeding journalists stories, and he was also the conduit for this Harvard tax scandal in 1985. The other thing is that Carl Bildt has been absolutely central in the Ukraine affair. He was the leading European foreign minister to promise this Eastern Partnership with Ukraine, which was a sort of false promise, and which, in a way, agitated the Ukrainian people. And that is yet to be explored anyway, and the Swedish journalists don't touch it. Second thing I want to say is that I actually interviewed the British Navy Minister, Keith Speed, who worked for Margaret Thatcher, and he said that these operations in Scandinavia were the most secret operations the British ever carried out in the Cold War, and that Margaret Thatcher authorized every single operation. So I don't think that the whole Cold War, it took 40 or 50 years for the most secret operations in the Second World War to come out, so I think we can wait another decade before this becomes a big story. And the final thing is that, Ola, presumably you mean that when the Swedish Navy were talking about the threat from the Soviet submarines, it was not the same members of the Soviet Navy who actually organized these operations. There's two separate groups of people, right? It was the ones who knew that it was a NATO operation, and the ones who thought it was a Soviet operation and then thought we have to kill Palme.
Yeah. Now, I mean, first thing is that these operations, I mean, Vidlek Eide, who some of you here knew, he said these operations were not NATO operations, they were national operations. They were British-American operations and not under NATO command, so to speak. But in Sweden, many people don't make the difference, you could say. But secondly, true. I mean, it is very few people knew anything. I spoke with one person who knew, who said, and I asked him if it was just a handful who knew this, and he said it's much more. It's which means, you know, at least 20 that knew, and also when I spoke with John Lehman, who was the Secretary of Navy, on a trip, and he was standing talking with Bengt Schubach, who was the Chief of Navy in Sweden in the 80s, and I had spoken a lot with John Lehman before about what was who was running this operation, that it was Casey and so on, and then, or actually, the concrete running of the operation was done by the National Underwater Reconnaissance Office, and the head of this was Secretary of Navy John Lehman. And and he said before that he couldn't tell which Swedes were involved in these operations, because then he had to kill me afterwards. And then I went up to them and asked him which Swedes were involved in this. And then Lehman said, I told you before, I had to kill you afterwards if I would tell you that. And then Bengt Schobach said, many people in Sweden would be happy about that. And many means more than 20. So that means it's some people. I mean, all of them were not Navy. I mean, it was some people in the hidden deep state of Sweden that knew about this operation. Sorry?
So I think that this concludes the session, and we'll have another 10-minute break, and we'll come back exactly 3:15. Welcome back, everybody. Please be seated. Please be seated. The next session, New Wars, Geopolitics, Media and Deception, starts now. Anders Björnsson, yes, here you are. Ja, den är på. Ja, den är på, de styr den där inne. Japp. Okej. Och du är först. We're going to have a reception at 5. So we have to work first. Thank you. Yes. Our next speaker, Professor Anders Björnsson, is a Swedish historian with 25 years as a journalist and editor at Swedish Radio, Svenska Dagbladet, and Baltic World. He is the author of many books on Swedish history, initiated the Swedish Institute of Contemporary History, and for 15 years he was the chairman of the Swedish Humanities Association. He participated in the Nordic European Study Group from 1986, and he replaces the former director of PRIO and UP Sverre Lodgaard, whose flight from Riyadh was a more complicated trip than we thought when we planned the seminar. So, welcome, Anders Björnsson.
Thank you very much for being invited here. It's a privilege, of course, and a pleasure as well for me to say a few words on this special occasion in honor of Ola. During the years, Ola has become both a dear friend and an important advisor of mine. And I have learned a point that Iver Neumann touched upon in his intervention earlier this afternoon, that Ola is a profoundly literary person, a man of letters. Therefore, I shall start my little presentation by a belletristic example. In the year 1912, the Swede Gustav Jansson published a novel, Lögnerna, berättelser om kriget. It simultaneously appeared in London as Pride of War and in Leipzig as Lügen, Geschichte vom Kriegen. A few years later, the book was translated into Polish. Gustav Jansson, born 1866, at his time a well-known journalist and best-selling writer, since then has fallen in complete oblivion. He's no exception. Most of the turn of the century people have. Jansson had made early attempts to become both an actor and a painter, without much success, however. He chose another career, cultivated ties to the young labor movement in Sweden, and by posterity has been characterized as Sweden's Jack London. Like London, he was a social critic. His books portray people on the margins or people in great danger. Adventurers, upstarts, workers going on strike, or poor islanders in a state of permanent enmity somewhere in the archipelago of Stockholm, in waters where submarine activities were later to be discovered or not discovered. Lögnerna, the book, is about a war before the Great War. The Italian assault in 1911 on 3 Ottoman provinces that during 2 decades of brutal occupation were to become Libya. 10 years earlier, Gustav Jansson had protested against atrocities on the battlefields and in prison camps during the South African Boer War in his novel Abraham's Offer, Abraham's Victims, with a pronounced anti-British tendency. Lögnerna, or Pride of War, can be read as a general plea for peace, as an attack on interventionism, and as a critique of warmongering, deception, and popular propaganda for war. The book sold well and was highly acclaimed internationally by Berta von Suttner, among others. Its author was even mentioned as a candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize, both in Britain and in the US. But as soon as 1913, he succumbed to jaundice and died. The idea of humanitarian interventions had been invented and elaborated in the 19th century, particularly in connection with wars of secession within the Ottoman Empire, when European great powers, France, Great Britain, Russia, came to the rescue and protection of suffering populations, especially Christians, whether they were Catholics, Orthodox, or belonged to some other denomination. Gustav Jansson, in his Tripoli novel, attacks the very idea of humanitarian interventionism. He raises questions, more or less eternal, of virtues, of progress, of dignity, of righteousness, and of civilization. While the Italian aggressors are devastating the city of Tripoli, one of the book's fictional characters on the Ottoman side, in this war of airstrikes, the very first to be fought ever, asks an emissary from the Sublime Porte, "Can you tell me," he says, "why Europe, the second smallest continent, with all its nations divided against one another, nevertheless succeeds in maltreating and repressing not only a single country, but whole races? Can you tell me that?" Exactly 100 years later, Ola Tunander, Swede by birth, Norwegian by choice, published his study, Geopolitics of the Libya Crisis, in Swedish translation known as Libyenkrigets geopolitik, humanitär intervention eller kolonialkrig. I remember I had asked a number of friends to dedicate themselves to this very subject. Ola was the one who responded. In this tiny but well-documented book, Ola scrutinizes in a scholarly manner the arguments for war in 2011, the nature of the rebellion in Libya, the motives and preparations of the assailant coalition of countries. He questions assertions of imminent genocide by the Libyan government and much of the press coverage from the struggles. And he challenges the human right discourse, regarding it more or less as a pretext for aggression. In much of this, Ola can be seen as a Gustav Jansson of the 21st century. In the summary of his book, Ola concludes, I quote, "There is enough evidence to say that the war in Libya in 2011 was very similar to the traditional colonial wars of France, the UK, and the US. Small NATO states like Norway, and the Swedish edition Sweden, though not a NATO ally, is added, were seduced to participate in the war and to believe that the war was an operation within the framework of responsibility to protect. Also states like Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa were seduced by the global media and various human rights organizations to believe that this operation was something different than a regular colonial war. The planning and the sophisticated use of Qatari and Emirati special forces as a UK, US, French interface to the Islamist and tribal forces indicate a well-organized attack. Together with the Syria operation with a similar use of Islamist foot soldiers and the proposed Iran war, the Libya war appears to be a continuation of the Iraq war and a continuation of the 2001 decision to go to war against any oil-rich state that potentially might ally with the rising powers, primarily China. All these wars appear to be part of a strategy on the part of the US, that is, of a strategy for a general geopolitical shift. Unquote. Of course, this is a highly controversial notion and one with far-reaching consequences. What is striking, however, is how little serious discussion such critical remarks have generated in the aftermath of the war. This might be all the more surprising in otherwise peaceful countries like Norway and Sweden, who both broke with their traditions of non-engagement and contributed Norway significantly to the war effort. Now, had this second Libyan war, as Ola claimed, really a touch of colonialism, as the first one obviously had? Was it in essence about control, about spheres of influence, about oil, and about a general geopolitical shift, as Ola explicitly states? For some years, focus in the international community has been on Syria. However, as Patrick Coburn and others meticulously have demonstrated, the Syrian civil war, the multitudes of ethnic and religious violence in that utterly crisis-ridden part of the Middle East cannot be separated from what happened in Libya. Holy warriors and religious militants have gained a lot from the Libyan legacy. In plain words, the case of Libya might be read as a textbook for the murder of a state. Ola in this has a strong case, it seems to me. Already during the bombings in the spring of 2011, he called for action against foreign intervention in Libya. He urged the Norwegian government to withdraw from the fighting. Colonial paternalism, he claimed, has been dressed up in an attire of human rights. He stressed that the rumors of an imminent massacre in the city of Benghazi was built on sheer lies concocted by a machinery of disinformation. I quote him from an article in the daily Aftenposten from November 2011. Gaddafi hardly prepared a massacre in Benghazi, Ola claimed. He didn't threaten young demonstrators. They were innocent, he said. They should hand over their weapons. They would not be punished. His, Gaddafi's menace was aimed at the military insurgents, against the foreign agents, and against Al-Qaeda, unquote. Now what followed? The destruction of Libya through foreign interference, as we know, was a tragedy. It might even be argued that a tragedy within the tragedy is that this very outcome was all but predicted. When it comes to wars on the shores of Libya and its neighbors, already in the 17th and 18th centuries, Western powers tried to get rid of certain obstacles in the Mediterranean waters, namely the disastrous traffic of pirates causing huge losses of cargo and crews. There were estimates to the effect that a total of 1 million Europeans and a few Americans were taken as slaves as a result of this practice, some being released to enormous amounts of money, while most of them, for instance some hundreds Icelanders, perished. The ruling elites in North Africa on their part collected fees or tributes to protect merchant ships from being robbed. In 1801, a US naval force on the orders of President Jefferson entered the Mediterranean, and on August the 1st, USS Enterprise defeated a Tripolitanian warship in an initial battle. US Marines were to fight for another 4 years before they won a decisive victory outside the desert city of Derna in the province of Cyrenaica, the first successful war on foreign soil in US history. It is still an event of symbolic significance in the annals of the US Marines. Curiously enough, the Kingdom of Sweden, an imperial power in its last stage of decline and decay, had been an ally to the embryonic world power when this 1801 to 1805 war in Libya broke up. I am, to conclude, perfectly convinced that Ola would be able to make an excellent and thoughtful essay out of this strange coincidence, a contribution perhaps to the current Swedish debate on joining or not joining NATO. I hereby, Ola, invite you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Our next speaker, Professor Ola Tunander, became a journalist in 1973, was at PRIO in late 80s and early 1990s, and became a professor in journalism at Oslo University College in 1999. He's written several books about war journalism and the deception behind the recent wars in the Middle East. And he's been a chairman of the Norwegian Society for Press History and chairman of the Norwegian Society for Non-Fiction Authors and Translators, and he also participated in the Nordic European Study Group seminars.
Thank you. It's a great honor for me to talk today and honor Ola. I've learned a lot from him. I asked to have a PowerPoint presentation because one essential wisdom, I think, is that the visuals are much more important than written text in the things that we talk about. And the visuals speaks to the heart. It sticks in the brain more strongly than the written word. So this is why I tend to use my time to show a couple of examples. Actually, I came to know Ola when I started as an information director in 1989 here at PRIO. And I was not sure at the time whether I should continue as a journalist or what I should do. Then the Gulf War came. And I was able to get some research funding and started research myself. And this is actually one of my first scientific publications. And at the same time, I also had absence of leave for a couple of months where I worked at the Norwegian news agency at the news desk during the Gulf War. So after the war was finished, I was asked at the head of our department to do a summary of our coverage. And I was deeply shocked how easily media fall into the propaganda trap. And basically I decided to stop being a journalist and rather go into academia and criticize other journalists who also are taking for the ride all the time. And basically this is what I've been doing. And there's a direct link between this publication and my last publication together with Stig Arne Norstedt, my Swedish colleague, and this is also a link to Ola actually, because the comparison between Sweden and Norwegian media in these issues is quite interesting and essential. And many of the issues starting from the Gulf War, both when it comes to media military relation, but also in general war history, I think actually the Gulf War is still underestimated what significance it has even for the war against IS today. So the thing about the Gulf War, this is a famous quote from the media researcher George Gerbner. The boiling point is reached when the power to create a crisis merges with the power to direct the movie about it. And the movie in this case is the global CNN coverage, because that was, at that time, the only global 24/7 channel. And it controlled totally the media image globally. And actually, Al Jazeera was created as a direct response to this, because the Arab world would never again allow the US media to define for the whole global picture what the reality is. And second point here is it was a total successful media control operation in the press center in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, where the press center was, there was censorship, there was pool system. The picture coming out of that war was the smart bomb images, which of course totally proved to be a wrong picture. The most bombs fell were dumb bombs, 92% of them, but this was the image. And this was part of the reasons why I went into this area. I want to distinguish between propaganda and PSYOPs, since I asked to talk about propaganda. You can see one good definition here is basically done by non-government actors, by governments, by PR companies. Anybody can do propaganda. ES, ESIL, whatever, they are very good at it. And they use the visuals, as I talk about, in a very professional manner. They know what they're doing. So propaganda is a definition like this. PSYOPs, on the other hand, is a part of a military operation. It's information warfare done by the military. And in my examples, I was distinguished between the propaganda and the PSYOPs examples. The NATO definition of PSYOPs is very similar to the US Pentagon, and Norwegian forces in Afghanistan have done PSYOPs operation. And of course, the thing here is that it's part of the military strategy that are aimed to ultimately change the behavior of foreign government, organization groups, and individuals. And of course, the central notion here is about perception management. This is a new definition, but I tend to use PSYOPs because that's the important thing. I will use one. I've been told to talk about Iraq and Libya. Leading up to the Iraq War, there was, of course, the big lie about the weapons of mass destruction that started the whole thing. I will not go into that, but rather have a couple of small stories to exemplify how the media management, PSYOPs, and propaganda direct affects the media coverage. This story is about the toppling about the statue in Baghdad when the invasion forces went in, and it's deconstructed in detail in this essay in the New Yorker. Interviewed all parties involved, and one essential thing is, of course, that it was the PSYOPs unit who tore the statue down. Initially, it was very early known that this was a PSYOP operation, but me and many others thought that it was a planned PSYOPs operation from the start. The essay in the New Yorker documents that it actually wasn't a plan, but the PSYOPs unit, when they saw the statue, thought that this was a very good idea and took it there and then. Of course, they did a mistake to put the American flag first and change it to the Iraqi, which ruined the operation, of course, in the whole Arab world. But the main thing, it was meant for the Western audience. And of course, the idea was to reshape the notion of tearing down statues. When was the last time statues were teared down? Polo communism, Lenin, Stalin, etc. You know, get the point. So this was to try to create that kind of emotions and perceptions, and the media bought it totally. And this was made as a proof that the Americans were welcome. It was like in all global media, also in Norwegian media. Actually, the only journalist that was present that covered it live was Åsne Seierstad. She was at the stairs of Palestine Hotel, and she said in broadcasting, there are very few people here. Some chant against the Americans, some cheer them. That was quite true. That this was what happened. Very few people there, but the headlines, of course, thank you. Actually, VG, they had reporters other places, so, and they were not in Baghdad at the time. So also Norwegian media reconstructed this created event as an actually spontaneous rise from the Iraqi people. If you look at the place, you can see it's almost empty. Some of those are even identified as Chalabi's people from the Free Iraqi Forces that came in with the Americans. And not in with the Americans, but where, yes, you want?
You can also see that it's sealed off with tanks, so the public should not enter the place.
Okay, so this was the PSYOPs operation. Now the propaganda version, because this is another story that was very influential, but this was not a PSYOPs operation. This was a spin story under leadership from the top people in White House. The Jessica Lynch story, this is Aftenposten portraying our welcoming home to a home city, portrayed as a war hero, welcome home afterwards. And the story was that she was taken as a prisoner, wounded in battle, freed by some American troops, and they even took her from the hospital where she was and filmed it with soldiers entering the hospital with blank shots, so that you can hear the shots. But actually, she was in a car accident. She was taken to the hospital by local people, and the Iraqi doctors who treated her said afterwards that to BBC, who made a documentary about it, that they wanted to get rid of her because they had a lot of wounded people to be taken care of. But this was constructed as a war hero story. And when the movie that was taken to the press center in Doha and shown to the public, and it went worldwide as a story. I will show just one example how this directly affects the editing of a Norwegian newspaper. Because VG that day had 2 editions. This is the first edition, which is actually a rare article in VG at the time about the true face of the war. A family had been totally wiped out by mistaken bombing. This guy has 5 children at least who was killed, and cries out his anger. And then the Jessica Lynch story breaks, and this is the next version. That original story is just 1 column. Now the spin story about Jessica Lynch takes the room and visually steals the first story. And of course this is made by the US correspondent of VG, who told the story as it was told from the press center in Doha. And Jessica Lynch said afterwards in a Senate hearing that she never understood why this lie was constructed. And she felt very uncomfortable about it, and the only hero that she felt was a hero was her female co-soldier who tried to save her. So in all respect to VG, they corrected the story a few months after the deception story was told, but then it had already been working as it should be. So the issue of Libya, and how much time have I left now? 5 minutes, okay. Few words about Libya. Of course, I've written an academic article about the Norwegian coverage, which was like very critical. And when Terje Tvedt, now the last few months we actually had the beginning of a public debate in Norway about the Libya war. Even though the parliament turned down the suggestion to have an inquiry, it will come sooner or later. When Terje Tvedt launched his idea of a campaign, I also wrote an article in Aftenposten said that the media themselves should have an independent investigation, whether they were independent or not. Of course, the name of my article is how they missed the big story, the Norwegian media and the Libya war. And the big story is, of course, linked to the EU and the UN mandate. Was the invasion and the Norwegian military acting according to Resolution 1973? I will not go into detail, but the mandate is very weak, to put it mildly. Of course, Benghazi was mentioned. Part of this problem is not only what is written, but what is not written. The city of Sirte, which was the main stronghold of Gaddafi, unlike Benghazi, this city looked like that afterwards, where actually civilian people have to move out. They were never reported as a potential threatened civilian victims. And one thing which amazes me really is when Norwegian reporters talk about these kind of issues. They are very concerned, rightly so, by journalists being attacked for being a journalist in many conflicts. And this is a huge problem. I work on a UNESCO project on this right now, and it is real problem. But for some reason, when NATO bombs the television building in Yugoslavia in 1999, Libya television during their bombing, this is never framed as an attack on freedom of expression and journalists. You can, of course, say that Gaddafi did not have any independent television. But come on, how many countries do have state propaganda through the television, but they are rarely bombed? So this is a big so the silence is another problem, of course. Okay, and when I worked at PRIO, I had this project on enemy images. And of course, one part of the enemy images is to dehumanize the other. And what do you do with a crazy dog? You slaughter it as a crazy dog, of course. So the rhetorics build up to the practice, and with few critical discussions about principal issues like whether the resolution actually had regime change as part of its mandate. One story at the end here. The story came out that Gaddafi had equipped his soldiers with Viagra so that they should rape more efficient. When I heard that story, Sissel brought it. I know her and I respect her deeply. I wrote an email to her. Where did you get that story from? Because in my ears, when something smells propaganda, it's usually propaganda. And this story smelled propaganda. And this was looked into by the Amnesty, and they found no basis for it whatsoever. And then they came, now I'm at the final point, going back to the Gulf War. When this was talked critically about this by NGOs, they said this is another incubator story. And what was the incubator story? This was in November 1990, where the Senate was going to discuss whether to make a case for war or not. Of course, the coalition with a UN mandate came out of that, but essentially, for those who had looked into it, was this press conference held by Hill and Knowlton with their customs, where the exiled Kuwait government, and at the press conference, this alleged nurse said that she had personally experienced that Saddam Hussein forces came into Kuwait City, took the babies out of the incubators, let them on the floor to die, and stole the incubators back to. This is written documentaries, and this was a total construction. It was a purely lie. And the alleged nurse proved to be the daughter of the Kuwait ambassador who was sitting crying in the room. And those who have gone into the decision process said that this press conference actually was quite important for the outfall of that. Okay, I've gone over my time, sorry.
Thank you. Ola,
I'm just
comments.
making a couple of small 2 minutes comments. First, I forgot, because Matthias showed books before, so I have to show this Secret War book that came out in what was a submarine case that came out in 2004. And this this Libya book that, and Anders Björnsson did not mention that he wrote a forward to this book also. But no, I started to look into this Libya war and was a bit shocked. And one information that I thought was quite interesting was that one Norwegian journalist from TV2 actually came to Benghazi immediately after the demonstration started, long before the war started, the first demonstrations. And it was already a professional press center taking care of every journalist. So it was run very smoothly. And then he was staying there for a couple of weeks. And when he went down in the reception in the middle of the night, there were 50 Special Force soldiers from Qatar coming in. And it turned out that it was around 1,000 Special Force soldiers from Qatar. And the British Chief of Defense went back and forth to Qatar because the British could not run a war in Libya because the people who were fighting against Gaddafi was to a large extent Islamist or Al Qaeda or whatever, and that so you had to have an interface. You have to have someone that you give order to that give order to the people below them. So you had to have the Qataris. So the Qataris were, they were, more than any others. But there were also others from Sudan. There were quite a lot of force from Sudan, because Gaddafi had not treated. He had supported the opposition in Sudan, and that means that the Sudanese come up with forces, and then there were some opposition people also in Libya, but the NATO was actually running the air force, while you had various Arab states running the ground forces, and that was, you could see from when the whole thing started, when they started to train the Emirati forces in the autumn, and they put them in the spring 2011, you could say that it was some preparation for this war. And I'm certain that Norway, I don't know, but I think that none in the Norwegian government knew this, and that it was when the Vidlek Eide, who was the chief of defense, and then in Norway, late 80s, and then he was chairman of NATO Military Committee, and he told me that the Americans and the British told him nothing. That was he got his information from Norwegian military intelligence, and NATO has no intelligence capability. So, and the Americans and the British, they keep their information. They don't give it away to NATO. And in this case, it was a French, British, US operation, and the Libya was just a continuation. So the guy, the Libyan guy, who claimed to having all his money because he was operating for the American intelligence, he was leading the forces into Tripoli to take over Tripoli in the Libyan war, and then he immediately moved to Aleppo, and was leading 6,000 men in Aleppo, and they brought a lot of Libyans with them to Aleppo. So it was the same war. And then when nowadays, when there is some kind of conflict in the US administration, they publish Hillary Clinton's private emails that says following. So it's, it's one guy, was Sid, what's his name? I've forgotten. Blumenthal. And he writes about the French argument for the war. The major argument was that you have to. Gaddafi had 143 tons of gold and the similar amount of silver, and he wanted to create an African currency using this gold and silver, and that the French was a bit afraid of. What would be the consequences of this? And then also they had not so big share of Libyan oil, and the Libyan oil is I don't remember now if it was 40-50% of the African oil reserves. So it was quite important, and France. This was a war against Italy, you could say, and then they wanted to increase the French influence in Northern Africa and improve his internal political situation in France and provide the French military with an opportunity to reassert its position in the world and address the concern of his advisors over Gaddafi's long-term plans to supplant France as dominant power in Francophone Africa. That was the French argument. And I think this is, and it's tragic that Norway just buy, or Sweden, whatever, that you don't have any, you could say, any research at the institutes that are able to confront this information. Thank you.
I think that we should actually take a break now, and then we have more time for the discussion after the last session. Is that okay? Okay. Okay. Kom. Ta det bort. Ja. Thank you, everybody. The last session, dual state, security state and securitization. And our first speaker is Ole Wever. Professor Ole Wever is a Danish international relations scholar and director for the Center for Resolution of International Conflicts. He is the former director of the Center for Advanced Security Theory and initiator of the Copenhagen School of International Relations, where he developed the securitization theory. The Open University channel presents Ole Wever together with Samuel Huntington, John Mearsheimer, and Ivan Neumann, and Andrew Moravcsik as some of the few leading theorists on international relations theory in the world. A couple of years ago, the US TRIP survey described Neumann and Wever as the two most creative international relations scholars in Europe. Together with Tunander, Wever started the Nordic European Study Group in 1985 and was then at the Copenhagen Peace Research Institute until 1999, when he became a teacher and professor at the Copenhagen University. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. I'm pleased to be part of this step in your PRIO relationship, as well as many of the others. Ola, I do believe I was the one to tell you about a job opening at PRIO originally and pointing you in this direction. And you were a little worried at that time about this peace research thing, that whether there really would be a shared idea of research and whether you would really do peace research. And I know that PRIO has shared some of those concerns at some points along the way. And I think we have been, in that sense, at a parallel track, fighting a common battle for also what peace research can contain, what can count as peace research, what are the kinds of things you can do. And I think this meeting today represents in itself an interesting testimony to what would not probably have happened at PRIO if it were for you. These issues will not be on the peace research agenda otherwise. The title I've been given here is Securitization, Morgenthau, and the Dual State. That is probably a puzzling title for most. I think it's probably primarily Ola and myself who see that as a very obvious combination. So let me just tell the story of why Morgenthau is in the title. For those who are not in my discipline, Hans-Jürgen Morgenthau, author of this book, for instance, is a German-American theorist who has been seen as the main instigator of the realist tradition, the dominant realpolitik, power political tradition in international relations scholarship, and very much the dominant mainstream figure for decades. So the reason why Morgenthau pops up here, I think, is that Ola visited me many, many years ago and told enthusiastically about something that excited him at the time. Maybe it was about submarines, maybe it was something about the assassination of Palme, I don't remember. But you started also floating there some of the first ideas of the dual state idea. And I was at the time reading Morgenthau, so I pulled out this book and found surprisingly that dual state was in here as well. This mainstream guy, this traditional, this guru of what you would teach to establishment figure, he would write worriedly about trends in US security policy and say, here comes a long quote, this shift has occurred, and his reference is the US in the 50s, and then he says, this shift has occurred in all modern totalitarian states and has given rise to a phenomenon which has been aptly called the dual state. It is characteristic of the dual state that in it, as a matter of law, the power of making decisions remains with the authority charged by law with making them, while as a matter of fact, by virtue of their power over life and death, the agents of the secret police coordinated to exert an effective veto over the decisions. And then with time, the official state, so to say, learns to adapt to the real power, and there's no reason really to adjust anymore because they will have learned on their own to do the things that are expected. And that was, of course, striking that this very radical argument about the dual state could be found in this very celebrated and established text. And so I think for both Ola and myself, there was also an element of a tactical ploy here that it was helpful to latch on to a guy like that, and then you could make your dual state arguments. I could make arguments very similar in securitization theory about how the arguments about necessity, emergency would enable a state to force drastic measures on people and so on. So this is a very nice fit. In that sense, the title has, I could almost end here, say securitization, Morgenthau, and the dual state. These three things come nicely together, and that's basically the same point. And we just pulled poor Morgenthau along because that would help to legitimize to some extent that it was not as far-fetched what we're trying to do. But however, I would like to complicate things a little by trying to push two questions that one can play around with in this triangle. And the one question is what is really the ontology of this security state, the deep state? Yeah, you better take notes because it might be things you have to answer to. So really this security state, this deep state, what's at the bottom of this? And the other one is what will be our analytical political stance towards it? So first, I'll summarize a little more from the Morgenthau article from 55, then another Morgenthau, and then get into the more critical reflections. The article by Morgenthau actually goes so far as to present US security policy as, quote, the surrender of sound principles of policy. And in this he argues that the security system put into place in US policy in 1953, the philosophy of security had become a mythology, and the politics of security a grand ritualistic performance, leading to a range of sacrifices for no good purpose. He's really arguing that there is no real need for this. It is not something that really justifies it, and we end up with a psychology indistinguishable from that of a police state. So it's a high price paid for nothing. And this nothing here is what I would like to talk about. Nothing is important here because most who turn to securitization theory or to the dual state analysis, for instance, in relation to the global war on terror, probably do it because there's an interest in focusing on this production of emergency, the corruption of a proper political sphere, the arguments for this excessive threat, and so on, in order to show how it's being produced really for no good reason, for no justifiable reason, etc. But then let's take another Morgenthau text. His most famous book, Politics Among Nations, a textbook that generations were brought up on. There he writes, democratic constitutions, especially those consisting of a system of checks and balances, have purposely obscured the problem of sovereignty. Now we get the theme of sovereignty. And glossed over the need for a definite location of the sovereign power. People have started believing, and this is not technical, started believing in all kinds of constitutional doctrines and legal controls and so on. Back to the quote. In this endeavor to make democracy a government of laws and not of men, they forget that in any state, democratic or otherwise, there must be a man or a group of men ultimately responsible for the exercise of political authority. Since in a democracy that responsibility lies dormant in normal times, barely visible through the network of constitutional arrangement, it is widely believed that it does not exist. Yet in times of crisis and war, that ultimate responsibility asserts itself, as it did under the presidencies of Lincoln, Wilson, and the two Roosevelts, and leaves to constitutional theorists the arduous task of arguing it away after the event. So really, there in those moments of crisis, we see where the power really was, and that is good because these are the hero presidents that actually did what had to be done, and then we have all the legal scholars to afterwards explain that we didn't see what it looked like, what we saw. So in a sense, it's the same argument Morgenthau is making here, but it has a very opposite tone. It is the argument about this dual state, but here is actually the heroes that come out of the deep state and save us in a moment of crisis. Take action and step up when necessary. So this puts us to the question, is there some kind of hardcore? Is there something at the bottom, a structure? Do we really need the dual state? Is it something we should have and ought to have? Or is there some reason why it has to be there? Not just because of trickery, but because there is a structure to it. And as Eva already mentioned, in Ola's book on naval strategy, Cold Water Politics, there's an underlying geopolitical structure of weapon systems that determines when necessity kicks in. You can look at the map, you can look at the weapon systems, you can look at all these, and that is really what explains when things start to get hot. And you could say we have a similar field today. When we look at, for instance, Russian opposition to missile defenses and so on, this is not just about securitization and enemy images or whatever. You could say it's almost like it's the nuclear weapon systems themselves that determine that Russia has to resist US missile defense. So in that sense, isn't there a material weapon structure that determines when you really start to touch the power structure? So that's a question. In what exact sense is there a state inside the state? In my discipline in international relations, most debates on the state go wrong because we have on the one side those who say that the state is an abstraction, it's a unitary thing, the state is just the state. And then others who say, no, you have to break it up and look into the state and so on. And then by definition, there's no the state because you're looking inside it. But in a sense, the whole clue is that inside the state, one of the actors is the abstraction of the state. So among the many voices in the state, one of the voices is the abstract idea of the state playing against all the others. In your Cold War writings, and then you make the Grossraum argument about the US, and that's one form of a structure of intelligence agencies that is, in a sense, the nervous system of this whole thing. Today, we maybe see in the Snowden NSA age another nervous system where the electronic intelligence agent system maybe is turning out to be the real bottom line. But again, it's the argument that there is an ultimate power structure, and naturally things happen when you get close to that. So my question really is what is at the heart of this deep state? Nothing but a performative political act to create necessity? Or is it a particular network of people? It's people who are the deep state. Or is it some kind of technical view structure of weapon systems that ultimately define the deep state? I think this has implications for our political strategy towards it, how we relate to this, how we think about what do we look at the dual state as something bad, just it's something we criticize, or is it something we relate to in some other way? Morgenthau himself had a political ethos where I think the core really was that we should have more politics. We should have a kind of existentialist expressivism of doing politics. He wanted leaders to lead and then lots of dissent up against those leaders. Not a kind of harmonious, silenced state getting people to just follow. But he felt in that sense that there was both too little leadership and too little dissent. And that is one way of looking at how we should relate to that power. We should in a sense have both more power and more critique of it. And I think that has been argued even better somewhere else. I looked in my messy office with too many books and found this funny little black one. Unfortunately, Eva already stole my thunder a bit on this one, but I'll say a little more about why the black dove here is really subtitled Essays on Power, Technology and History from '85 is really the answer to this question. As you can see, my copy is really very worn here. It was a great influence and inspiration for me back in the mid-'80s because it was a very serious reflection on the whole situation in the new Cold War, new social movement, European identities. And Ola argued very originally there that hope could not be in any kind of counter power. It was not to find a better power to put up against the dominant power. We could be only a critique of power where you had to recognize the reality of the military power structure. And that it would be from that very military power structure one had to take off and fly off from there. And therefore the title refers to an image that is reproduced in many versions in here. I can't open the book fully because then it'll fall apart, but here of like this black dove flying over the Berlin Wall, where the argument was of course that it was a black one. It was not the white dove of peace with its aspirations for paradise or for something beyond power and weapons or something like that. There was no hope for good power. We had to recognize the reality of power, criticize it, push it back, but also engage intellectually in and with it. Morgenthau and even more his fellow realist Niebuhr argued that power always deserves critique even when we are the ones holding it. You have to exercise power, but even what we do is bad. Everyone is doing power, you have to do it, but it always also deserves to be criticized because power does. But Ola's highly original intervention 31 years ago in the book was to challenge also the critics of power to say, we also have to abstain from the illusion of the good power, the illusion of reason and power ever coming together, ever finding any nice resolution to that. But what does that mean if we then turn that back on the dual state argument? What does that mean for how we look upon the deep state element, the security state element in the dual state? What is it really, and what role will it play, and how do we stand for that? Because I think there's a tendency for all of us to actually have forgotten that black dove argument and moved in the direction of just seeing it as something bad, seeing it as something that really shouldn't be there, and as if the ideal was the good state. So my conclusion here is that I think it's time for all of us to expose the timely dual state theory of the mature Tunander to the radical demands of the early Tunander.
And now, Ola will answer, and he will give his contribution to a theory, deep state and deception. So that's very good.
Wow. Thank you very much. It's no, I guess I have changed, you know, several times during my lifetime and so on, but still there are many things that you keep from the you say from the early 80s or whatever, when I wrote these things, and what changed me, I think, was also when I had talks with another military officer, Björn Eklind, who was a deputy chief of the Defense Staff Intelligence Service in Sweden. I mean, the Defense Staff Intelligence was the official intelligence service. Then there was another intelligence service that were above this that were secret. And they had the ties, actually, or primarily they had the ties to the Western countries. And they were from the 60s and the 50s and 60s, the Social Democrats tried to control this intelligence service with Birger Elmer, who was a Social Democrat and was, you know, in certain respect similar to Trond Johansen in Norway, and some people know him well. But he lost his position. I mean, he retired in the early 70s, I think, but he controlled this service anyway for some years. But then it was a change from late 70s, I think. And but I had a lot of talks with Björn Eklind, who was a deputy chief of Defense Staff Intelligence, and he became the captain of the signal intelligence ship Orion, and he was more of a kind of neutralist, so to speak. I mean, he thought one should follow the government policy, and he realized firstly that it was Americans on board that he didn't know about, and secondly that the signal intelligence people with the Americans were, you know, just running the American tasks, checking the SA-10 systems for shooting down the cruise missiles and so on. And he just said to the Americans, "You have to leave. I don't want to won't have you here." And then he was kicked out as a captain of the ship, of the signal intelligence ship. It's also like the Marietta in Norway. And if you have a relatively senior officer, they had to explain that to the government or to the cabinet even. And so instead of saying that he didn't want us to work so closely with the Americans, they said that he was part of the naval officers' revolt against Olof Palme, and implied in a sense that he was perhaps part of the planning for killing Olof Palme. And that, of course, was bought by the government representative that I spoke with, who had thought that Björn Eklind was a very dangerous person, but actually had supported the government policy. And when we spoke about these things, we found an apartment that you couldn't listen to so easily, and it was no way you could, because you could always listen to. You could send a beam towards the window, and you could get the vibration of the window. That was and that was already in the mid-80s actually, and and that means that they could listen to what you said. So we found a place to talk and so on. But all this were, you realized there were certain structure parallel to the regular government or state that operated according to very different laws and logic. And this, and then I saw also in Italy that you have, I mean, there was one guy who's called Franco Felice, who wrote about the dual state also. And his argument was that, I mean, the government is you vote, you have the domestic support. The problem with the state is that it's not just about domestic support. You have to have support from the protecting power. And that is not possible if there's too much difference between the domestic views and the views of the protecting power. So he explained this parallel state with the difference between US and Italian domestic understanding also. And this was so what they did, I mean, the Americans, they came up with to the military leadership, the ambassador and so on, up to the military leadership and said that we want this guy as chief of intelligence, and they usually got it through, and they, at certain stages, they organized coups, military coups in Italy, that never were carried through totally. But it means that, I mean, in '64 they had a coup that was which mobilized quite a lot of people, with the lead of the former chief of military intelligence, but it was stopped because the government backed down. And in 1970, Prince Borghese, didn't we talk about Borghese before? No. But he was the chief of, had been the commander of Decima Mas during the war. And he was a leading fascist. He was recruited by the Americans, by Angleton. And this was and they were running this coup in 1970, and they took over the Minister of Interior and took a lot of weapons there, and they were going just to take over the Minister of Defense and the TV, and then there were signals from somewhere. Some argued that it was Angleton, other argued that it was Richard Nixon himself, but it's not perfectly clear who gave the signals. But the coup was stopped, and the policy was changed. And then there was coup attempts in '73 and '74 of similar caliber, and they put out a lot of bombs. And the same happened in Turkey, that you had this in 1980. They had a coup there, and they had put out a lot of bombs before, which means that you have to stabilize the country, and you had to get some generals to do the job. So General, what is it? Evren? Yeah, he called a guy that I had dinner with later. He was heading the Atlantic Committee in Turkey, actually, and we had a seminar. And he called him in the night and said that your father was a general, and you have been a foreign minister, and we want you as a defense minister, and we will make a coup tomorrow. and his wife understood that that this was that it was something going on, and tried to stop him and so on. But his father had been a general, and he had to accept that. It was his destiny, and he became defense minister. And Richard Pearl came, and they forced him into an agreement for very close Turkish-U.S. relationships. And the chief, or the station chief, the CIA station chief in Turkey, said that to Carter, who was president at the time, that it's our people who did it. Don't worry. But this is a kind of, in political science, this does not exist. This word is non-existent in political science. If you don't look at Morgenthau's words on dual state, for example, or if you do look at Ernst Frankl writings on dual state. And you could see that there is a structure, parallel structure, and Peter Dale Scott called it, he wrote about what is called the continuity of government. There was a development of, it was in parallel to the regular government, they developed a parallel government. You have Cheney and Rumsfeld, who was the chief of staff, or secretary of defense during Ford. And then they became secretary of defense, and then both of them became secretary of defense later in the 90s and 2000. But what did they do in the 1980s? They were in the continuity of government, the parallel power structure that would take over in case of emergency. And this is and when I were studying these submarine issues, you realize that it was something, it was I had a meeting with Tage G. Pettersson and Sten Andersson. I was going to meet Tage G. Pettersson, who was a defense minister, and then he asked, could I bring Sten Andersson also, who was a foreign minister, and this was after they left office, and they, as I understand it, put it that way, they had the same worries. That was their understanding. There was a parallel structure, and you couldn't do anything about it. Now I missed what I was going to say. but you could say in the submarine case, there were early on. Then in 1984, 85 or something like that, I was in contact with a guy who said he was a diver. He had put a wire to a sunken or damaged submarine in Hårsfjärden. This was in 1982, October, 5th October, 1440. I called him from my stepfather's telephone, as I usually do. And he said that we could meet early Tuesday morning, and this was a Sunday night, one day and a half later. And he got my telephone number and so on, and on the Monday afternoon he called back and said that I couldn't. It's not possible. I have been transferred to North Sweden. And then I called him in North Sweden, 2 weeks later and he said he couldn't speak about it. It's impossible. And okay, and so he didn't want, and then of course he couldn't, and he had signed papers also that he couldn't speak about it. And then, as a civilian expert in the submarine inquiry, I called him again 15 years later, and he said that and very few people knew that I was in this inquiry at the time. And and I called him and I said who I were, and we had talking before and so on, and he said, yes, I suspected that you would call. And I was never in Horsfjärden at Muskö, where these events took place. I was in Karlskrona, he said, which others says is not true. But that mean and then it was but that means that someone has, he left his apartment in Stockholm. He left his girlfriend and moved up to the north. And someone is doing that. Someone takes the decision, and the cabinet doesn't know. I mean, they are very curious about what happens and so on. And you could say in Sweden, this kind of differences were stronger much stronger than in Norway, at least. I mean, Norway is much more of a what you would call it's an old small farmers, peasant society, which means that you don't have an aristocracy that thinks they have the right to make coup attempts. I mean, this is during the Second World War, General Rappe, Axel Rappe, were preparing a military coup because he was pro-German and the government was not enough pro-German. And they had, he recruited people for the military coup, and exactly what happened is not clear, but the king, I think one problem was the king was ill, and he was not willing to support a military coup, and despite that he was quite pro-German actually. So nothing happened. And in the 1980s, there were one of the major critics of Olof Palme, who argued that people came up to him, high-ranking military officers, and wanted him in the new cabinet, and they said they have 250 men to take over the prime minister's office and 250 men for the TV and so on. And he said that you could take out Olof Palme in a better way and so on, and particularly this Harvard, because his son had been to Harvard, and he had been there because Olof Palme had given a speech at Harvard, and then it was arranged that he could that the son could study at Harvard, and this was not put into the Swedish tax system. So this was and this was a scandal, and Olof Palme had complained to this, and it was two different ways to get rid of Olof Palme. One was this Harvard affair, and second was military means and so on, or force. But what happened in the evening, the same night that he was shot these documents disappeared from the Swedish court system, from the electronic system. So it was, so in that sense, at least there was some kind of preparation when it comes to both these elements of getting rid of him. But I think the major point here is that there was a system, and who they are, I don't know. I mean, or some. I mean, some I know, and so on. But still, there is a parallel structure, so to speak, and it's in some countries it's more visible than in other countries, and they are in a certain respect above the law, and that is also the point with Carl Schmitt as a philosopher and so on, that it's that the sovereign, what he called the sovereign, is the one who decides on the exception. I mean, you have the law, and everyone, and the law is above everyone. But at some point, the law is not enough, and someone decides when the law is not enough, and that is what Carl Schmitt would call the sovereign. Oh, sorry. Okay.
Okay, so we still have 7 minutes. No, we can extend a little bit.
Jeg har lyst til å spørre deg, Tunander. Det som vi har fått
Engelsk. Kan du ta det på engelsk?
Oh, excuse me. Well, I would like to ask you if what you have been describing for us now is what is known as the GLADIO organization. Because we have a network in Europe, and it has spread at least over to Turkey. And there is this American whistleblower. She's originally from Turkey, and she has written a book called The Classified Woman. And she's been, talking a lot about these secret actions done in different European countries, especially after the Second World War. And somehow the Americans have had tentacles into Europe, organizing earlier fascists into a network of organizations threatening, for example, Italy in the 60s from getting too far to the left or whatever. Can you just say a few words about the GLADIO actions, if you know it?
So, yeah. No, of course. No, it was, I mean, you could say, historically speaking, you could say that the Anglo-American powers had to do something with the Nazi fascist people that were left after the war. They couldn't just kill them, so to speak. They had to get a job. And then they became stay-behinds. They became what was in Italy called GLADIO. And in certain countries, also like Sweden, there were, but I mean, in Norway because the resistance in Norway was not that were recruited from and so on, were not Nazi. I mean, of course, but in Sweden, you had pretty strong Nazi forces, and fighting on the Finnish front, and they were. So even in the 1980s, people from this time were very active in what became the planning for the killing of Olof Palme and so on, and that was it was one central figure from these years that and he was a teacher at the police college in psychology. And he was that, for a very long time. So it was, the people were accepted. My teacher in physics in school, he was a deputy head of the Nazi party. And I did know nothing about it, because no one spoke about it, because it was not proper or whatever. So it's so you had these forces, and not least in Italy and in Germany, they were very much Nazi forces in Germany, very much fascist forces in Italy and so on, and in Spain or whatever. But it was, and the Americans thought it was not enough that they were waiting for a new war. The idea with the stay-behinds was that when the Russians were coming, you had to have people with the arms caches and all these kind of things, able to fight a resistance, to start a resistance movement in the occupied Italy or Germany or whatever. But in the 60s and so on, the Americans thought that you could also use them for domestic purposes. So you put out some bombs and put the blames on the left, so to speak. And so you had, for example, one guy we had in the 69, one guy who was in the fascist organization Avanguardia Nacional. He, after the coup in Greece, then they were planning a new coup in Italy. In 67, and they're planning a new coup. He let the hair grow, so he adapted to the hair fashion in the radical left, and then put out bombs. And they put out bombs also in Milan, and you know exactly what happened, and they know who delivered the explosives. I mean, it was the counterintelligence chief in Italy in court, said that the Americans delivered the explosives for the bombing in Milan, and was a lot of people who died in '69, and Piazza Fontana, and it was from storage in Germany and so on, and this was all something that went on in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, I think, and then some people thought it was enough and tried to stop it and so on. But that was the Gladio, and this Sibyl Edmonds that you spoke about, she was translator in US, in the FBI, and she was and the problem was that she knew Turkish and Iranian or Farsi and so on, and people were saying very strange things. I mean that they had one thing was that it was a lot of things linked to the 9/11 events, and another thing was that it was linked to drugs. I mean, she spoke for the relevant Congress committee or House committee, and they said that you were not allowed to say anything. And but one thing was coming out later was that the Speaker of the House at the time received briefcases with dollars linked to which was directly linked to the heroin trade and so on. So, and this was of course, and during the Iran-Contras affairs, there were a lot of dirty things, but what was not said, despite that you had on paper, I mean, you had Oliver North's diary and so on, that the whole thing was paid with cocaine and sent to to Los Angeles and so on. So and this kind of, you could say it's a network. I don't know. I mean, it's a power structure that operates parallel to the regular democratic structure. And that is a little bit, in countries like Norway, this is not proper to say, actually, because because you should not.
Okay, we have one more question here.
Yeah, okay.
And I think we'll have to, anybody else who wants to be on the list? Okay.
Well, I don't disagree with Ole, but I have to tell you that Gladio was initially a legitimate organization like our own Stay Behind. It's part of the intelligence service. Yeah. It's called E14 in Norway. But it was Gladio 2 that was this parallel structure, this network, on the depth of the legal or legitimate organizations. And that is the really dangerous and what shall I say, rotten structure. So we have to discriminate between the legal organization, like Stay Behind was. They are about to be obsolete now, I think. But it was the structure in the depth of that, hiding behind the legal structure. That was really the bad organization.
Yeah, I could just agree with that. I mean, it was a court case in Italy that General Serraval was appearing. He was head of the Gladio, of the Stay Behinds, and it was about a bombing case, and there was one guy who was caught and so on. And the problem for this general was that, Gladio was extremely, or Stay Behinds in general, were extremely secret, and you only know your own group of people. You don't have any kind of overview. But then you had this guy, young guy, fascist, Ordine Novo, that lined out the whole structure in the court. And so what General Serraval said, there must be a parallel structure that I don't know about, that know the whole things. I have no idea what this is, but this man, what he says is true, but he shouldn't know it. And no one, and he, as a top general in the Stay Behinds, in the Gladio, he was not informed about this parallel structure.
Okay, one more, and I think that will be the last, actually.
I am the guy who did the documentary, Reagan's Deception. And I want to, in a way, enclose, for example, with Gladio that we talked about. That is Daniele Ganser, who wrote his thesis on that, became professor for that. And if he wants to give a lecture now in Germany, there's a shitstorm on Facebook and in the within journalists, and they prevent him from talking about it. What Ola tells about, I mean, he could call Ola Tunander or Ola Cassandra. Everything he says is true, I guess, but if he talks, for example, about it in Germany again in Wikipedia, he's called, meanwhile, an anti-Semitic nutcase. So to discredit people who talk about that is a very strong thing. And I would like to, as a journalist, I was very, very disappointed by my own profession, because our task would be to talk about these things, make clear that they exist, and then we have to talk about what we do. But in effect, it didn't happen. And now imagine what politicians have to think about a democracy where these things are possible, where they happen, and then afterwards they know that nothing happens. The people who do it are not punished. So you have to get the idea that the way to run a state is really this way. And then you're moving away from what we call a democracy. It's not only constitutional in a way, but it's moving away from the basis that we, the electorate, hear the truth and then make our decisions. So I would like to urge, especially the conservatives who are working against this, that either we tackle these problems or we have to say goodbye to democracy and go to something else. And that already happens there were some essays in Stratford who said the times of democracy are over. We're moving to have something more efficient. So that will probably come in the future, say that it has proven to be not efficient and we have to move to a more business-like structure of government. That's what we're heading for. And those who don't want that should work against it.
Okay, I think as a chair, I want to say a final word, actually. I think that what Ole Weve said about the nothing, the nothing is the most scary thing that you can ever imagine, and I really hope we can find out what, we don't want to keep it as a nothing. So that's all I want to say. So thank you, everybody. Thank you.